Around the world, the price of oil has dropped to four-year record levels at standing now around $70 per barrel. Some countries like Venezuela have urged OPEC to drop its production to raise prices. We are at the Central Bank of Venezuela in the lobby of the central bank, surrounded by beautiful artwork here. For more analysis on this trend of dropping oil prices from Professor Carlos Mendoza Potela. He is an economist and a professor of oil politics at the Central University of Venezuela. Professor, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
I want to start by analyzing what is causing this drop in prices. I've read that part of the cause is that countries out of OPEC have lifted their production, and therefore that has caused the drop of prices. Is that one of the causes, and what else do you see as some of the main causes of this trend?
Oil price in general is a variable that has always been multifactorial and one that depends on the decisions made in many different places around the world. Sometimes these decisions contradict themselves, and other times they follow the same direction.
La industria petrolera internacional está preparándose para
The international oil industry is getting ready for the depletion of light crudes following what happened back in 2004, with emerging China and India unexpectedly entering the scene as major consumers, causing an excessive increase in oil prices as investments were not ready.
Se provocó una elevación muy grande de los precios porque las inversiones no estaban listas.
In light of these circumstances, since 2004 up until 2014, oil prices reached the cost of $100 per barrel. The Economist claimed that $100 per barrel was the marginal cost of production and did not represent the cost of Saudi and Venezuelan outgoing production. The cost of production in Saudi Arabia oscillates between $5 and $8 and in Venezuela, a barrel costs $20. That is why it is not necessary to have a price of outgoing production of $70, $80.
Pero los crudos de aguas profundas del Golfo de México.
However, the deep water crudes of the Gulf of Mexico, the deep water crudes of Brazil, the shale oil of the U.S., and the tar sands of Canada are the new production centers that are going to replace the cheap conventional production. Nonetheless, these new resources are going to mean prices will again escalate in order to guarantee that all investments are made and that production is ready when it is required.
Para que las inversiones se hagan y esa producción esté lista en el momento en que sea requerida. Porque si no va a volver a pasar lo que pasó en 2004.
Otherwise, we're going to have the same situation that we had in 2004, when all of a sudden the world realized that China and India were there and that the offer didn't have a way to respond to the situation, leading to oil prices skyrocketing and then remaining high.
Por esa circunstancia. Sin embargo, la propia medicina
However, the same medicine to generate U.S. production, which implies greater costs, has meant that the USA is nowadays producing more light crudes, and this is affecting other countries that produce light crudes as well.
Algunos países que producen precisamente crudos livianos. En un cuadro que yo le mostré y que seguramente usted irá a mostrar.
In the graphic that I showed you, and I'm sure you're going to share this with the audience, we observed that production, or better said, U.S. demand for light crudes, has rapidly decreased over the last 4 to 5 years, and this situation is directly affecting two main producers of light crudes. Nigeria, whose exports to the U.S. are equal to 0, and Saudi Arabia, whose exports to the U.S. of 35-degree oil have also dropped dramatically. This situation has forced these countries to look for other market horizons and to offer discounts in those markets. Even before OPEC made this decision, Nigeria and Saudi Arabia, two members of OPEC, were competing for the Asian markets, such as Japan, Australia, and China, among other countries.
Lo mismo pasa con otros productores fuera de la OPEP.
The same situation is happening with other non-OPEC countries, and inside OPEC, Iran is another country that is doing the same. This is a country that is facing sanctions, which have forced Iran to offer discounts in the markets that are within its reach, because Iran has been vetoed in the European Union as well as in the US, due to the issue of Iran's nuclear program, although now it is in negotiations with the G5+1 alongside the OPEC summit that was held in Vienna.
Porque está vetado en la Unión Europea y en Estados Unidos. Entonces, son tres países de la OPEP que están obligados.
Thus, with these three OPEC member countries that are forced to offer lower prices, it was almost impossible that these three countries decide simultaneously to defend their prices in the Vienna summit, even though their offer will drop. They needed the oil prices to be at the level in order to defend their market share.
Necesitaban que los precios estén a ese nivel para ellos poder defender su cuota de mercado. Por el otro lado están los Estados Unidos, que con una producción muy costosa como es.
On the other hand, we have the US, whose production is very expensive because shale oil has a production cost that oscillates between $50 and $70 per barrel. However, shale oil has also been an element that has contributed to the drop in prices because it has replaced imports from other countries, from other producers of light crudes such as Nigeria and Saudi Arabia in the US national market.
Que producen crudos livianos, como ya le dije, de Nigeria y de Arabia Saudita. Esas cosas serían los factores que se podrían decir de mercado, pero hay otros factores, ¿no?
We can say that all of the above are the market factors, but there are other factors such as the geopolitical factors that have been significant in the drop of oil prices. For instance, the conflicts in the Middle East, the tensions between the US and Iran due to Iran's nuclear program, the tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and the religious conflict between Sunnis and Shias. All of these factors are also determining a drop in oil prices that is going to have a direct impact in three main countries, Russia, Iran, and Venezuela.
Fundamentalmente a tres países, Rusia, Irán y Venezuela.
Russia is facing sanctions imposed by the European Union and sanctions imposed by the US. Russia has also been blocked as a result of the Ukrainian issue. Senior energy officers of the Russian Federation have stated that Russia is going to lose about $100 billion if oil prices remain the same, and this is a real barbarity. Here in Venezuela, sectors of the opposition to the government have been saying that Venezuela is going to lose $20 billion and that next year Venezuela is going to have a fiscal deficit of $20 billion. I do not believe that any of those numbers are real, and this is not because I am feeling optimistic, because in fact the oil that is going to replace the current cheap oil is going to be very expensive oil.
From a market standpoint, you don't believe that this trend, this fall in prices is sustainable?
No, I do not believe it is going to be sustainable in the long term. As I have said before, and as you have seen in the scenario that I showed you until 2035, they are counting with the deep water oil of Brazil, oil from Iraq that is very cheap, but also oil from Venezuela and Canada that is very expensive, and even the same oil of the US that is shale oil. Shale oil needs to have a price of $100 per barrel in order to continue its flow in the long term. If there is no way to maintain the level of $100 per barrel, investors are going to be less committed.
Su compromiso. Ya en los Estados Unidos, en los financiadores, por cierto, de las perforaciones en Bakken.
In the US, the investors of Bakken drillings and others in Texas are already concerned because the credits they provided that have been crucial for the development of shale oil in the US
de las lutitas del shale norteamericano son créditos que ellos llaman junk.
Are credits that they consider to be junk credits because they have interest rates equal to zero.
Si los precios del petróleo caen,
in this sense, investors are afraid that if the trend of a drop in oil prices continues, they are not going to be able to recover these credits they already provided. So, there are several circumstances that are pushing for a new increase in oil prices in the midterm. What is difficult or complicated to determine is how long this midterm will take. The duration of this midterm could be tragic for some countries that are nowadays facing critical situations, such as Iran, Venezuela, and Russia.
And whenever oil prices do drop like this, countries like Venezuela, those other ones that you mentioned, get a little nervous. Should they be nervous? What have we seen in the past, and what else should they expect, countries that depend so closely on oil prices?
Siempre hemos tenido que estar nerviosos. Nosotros hemos mantenido una dependencia extrema.
We have always had to be nervous. We are too dependent on our oil revenues. Over the last 80 years, we have been trying to harvest from oil, in other words, to use oil as a key factor to boost and develop other productive activities that have not yet been successful.
Otras actividades productivas y no lo hemos logrado. Seguimos siendo
97% of the total amount of revenue that enters the country depends on oil. In this sense, if oil prices drop, that level of 97% will also drop. If the drop remains for a long period of time, it will cause economic problems in the country. However, the country has the ability to respond to the first stage in a short period of time. But if the situation continues for a long time, probably we're going to need to take some austerity measures. We're going to need to cut spending, among other things. What I do believe, even though my colleagues do not share my vision, is that this situation is not going to last too long. Because there are many people in the world who are interested in the development of all available oil. Not only oil from Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Libya, but the deep water oil of the North Sea that is depleting. The deep oil of the Gulf of Mexico, the oil from the Brazilian pre-sal, and the oil from Canada located in the tar sands, and the oil from Venezuela that is located in the Orinoco oil belt. The oil located in Canada and Venezuela are extra heavy oils whose cost of production are about $30 in Venezuela and $50 to $60 in Canada. Also, the shale oil in the U.S. has a high cost of production that oscillates between $50 and $80.
Cuyo costo está en el orden de 50-80. Entonces, con un precio de 70, unas empresas que están acostumbradas a tener beneficios.
So, with the oil price at $70 per barrel, there are some companies that are used to profit margins between 200 and 300%. These companies are not like smaller retailers that do not have any problem selling an item at $10 that cost them $9.
Un retailer será eso, ¿no? Un vendedor al detal, ¿no? Que tiene una mercancía que cuesta 9 y la vende a 10.
This, however, is not the case with the oil industry. The oil giants may endure the situation for a 6-month period, or even a year, but not for long. We will see a re-establishment of the balance in which profits, the ultra-profits of the oil giants, of the oil tycoons, is going to prevail.
Gigantes petroleros, los magnates petroleros se van a imponer.
Explain Venezuela's tactic of going to OPEC, trying to convince other OPEC countries to decrease production to therefore raise prices. Is that a tactic that has been used in the past? Has it ever been successful? And does Venezuela and other countries who agree with Venezuela have any chances of that happening this time?
It has worked before, but in this opportunity this is not going to happen because there are deep internal contradictions between Iran and Saudi Arabia, as well as amongst other countries. In addition, some countries have always helped OPEC, such as Russia, also have their own problems, and this tactic is not permanent. OPEC is an organization made up of members that share the same interests, the defense of their revenues and the defense of their oil prices. But when they have contradictory interests in two OPEC member countries, it is very difficult to reach a consensus. I think that in this opportunity there was no possibility of reaching a consensus, because 3 or 4 OPEC member countries, Algeria included, which is a country that produces light oil, are at risk now that the U.S. market has a lower demand for light oil. As a result, there is an oil surplus, and these countries have to sell it in Asia. But the question is, how can they sell it? Well, by offering discounts. So if there are 4 out of 12 OPEC member countries that are trying to obtain markets, if they can reach any overnight agreement to increase oil prices, we lose our part of the market. We can see how difficult the OPEC issues are.
Lo complejo que es la cuestión de la OPEP. La OPEP es un organismo de países.
Remember that OPEC is an organization of petroleum exporting countries that share one major interest, the oil price, and this shared interest sometimes is mediated by huge conflicts.
Y ese interés común a veces está mediado por conflictos gigantescos. Si tú piensas que durante 10 años
if you think that during 10 years, 3 OPEC member countries, Iraq, Iran, and Kuwait, were involved in a war against each other, and that during 10 years these countries were seated together, even in alphabetical order in OPEC. They were fighting a war on the ground, but at the same time they were clear that the defense of oil prices was something convenient for the 3 of them in spite of their contradictions.
Independientemente de sus contradicciones. En este momento, la defensa del precio.
Nowadays, the defense of the price of oil is not necessarily convenient, and it does not represent a shared interest between Saudi Arabia and Iran, because Iran is a country that has been sanctioned. Iran has always been a country that has promoted the defense of oil prices and the cuts in oil production. But today this is a move that Iran cannot make because Europe has imposed sanctions, and this country has no place to sell its oil. So there's a variety of realities that prevail over the theoretical will. I think that the decision made by OPEC in Vienna was the best. That is the reason why I decided to call it a solution of compromises, as I wrote in my article that I just shared with you. This is a solution within which nobody even mentioned the fact that maintaining the production ceiling today means, in fact, a cut in production. Because the production ceiling that OPEC refers to is about 30 million barrels per day, and OPEC is producing 32 million barrels today. So if OPEC truly abides by that decision, it must be pumping 2 million barrels less on a daily basis. But of course that is not happening. Simply it has been agreed to keep the current market conditions, whether or not there is a surplus of 2 million barrels.
So OPEC is going to meet again on June 5th in Vienna. Can we expect any agreements to come out of that meeting?
Yes, of course, but only if market conditions change too. OPEC will always be ready to cut production and to defend oil prices as long as it can do it. If there are big forces working against OPEC, even if they have the will to reach agreements, they are not going to be able to do it. For example, when you are involved in a war in which your sovereignty is at stake, in which your position as a leader in the Islamic world is at stake, which is the case of Saudi Arabia and Iran. Furthermore, if they are in a place where ISIS is active as well as many other fundamentalist forces that can launch an attack against one of these countries, then all of these factors will have a direct impact on the decisions made regarding oil prices.
Es decir, no estamos en una situación normal. En una situación donde, bueno, mira.
In other words, we are not in a normal situation at the moment. It is difficult to defend oil prices before consumers who make up the International Energy Agency and say they are our opponents, our enemies, etc., and that we are going to raise prices only for them. No, we can't do that. Those are not the current circumstances. The situation we have today is a lot more complicated, and it is mediated by various geopolitical interests and different powers, among other things.
All right, Professor, we'll be watching on June 5th, the next OPEC meeting. Thanks so much for your analysis and taking some time for us today.
For the question.
From Caracas, I'm Cody Weddle. We'll see you again next week.